The smell of warm laundry and dust filled the room as Linda knelt beside her bed, searching for a dropped earring in the fading glow of the afternoon sun. Her days had become a series of routines ever since her husband passed away. The silence in her house pressing in like a thick fog she couldn't escape. She hadn't realized her calico cat, Daisy, was so close to giving birth, but now there was soft mewling coming from the shadows beneath the mattress. The soft cries pulled her gaze deeper under the bed, where she glimpsed a tangle of tiny bodies squirming against Daisy's belly. But as Linda's eyes adjusted, one kitten seemed to be lying perfectly still, its fur damp and glistening, its tiny chest unmoving. And something inside Linda clenched with a dread she hadn't felt since the hospital that cold winter morning 2 years ago. You won't believe where this story leads. It's a journey that will stir even the hardest hearts and remind us how fragile and how fierce the will to live can truly be. Linda reached farther beneath the bed, her fingers trembling as they brushed over Daisy's protective body, and the warmth of the new kittens nestled close to her. The room seemed to grow smaller around her as she eased the unmoving kitten into her palm, its body alarmingly cool and floppy against her skin. Memories flooded her of trying to save her husband, of paramedics and flatlines, and the helplessness that crushed her soul, and now here she was. Kneeling on the floor, holding another tiny life caught between worlds, she could barely breathe as she cradled the kitten closer to her chest, listening desperately for any tiny sound, any flicker of breath. The other kittens mewled and squirmed, full of life, while this one remained a fragile silence in her shaking hands. Daisy stared up at Linda with wide golden eyes, as though pleading for help she didn't know how to give. The mother cat nudged Linda's arm with her nose, meowing in a low, anxious rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was as if Daisy, so protective and fierce, sensed that one of her babies was slipping away and was placing her trust in the only human she knew. Linda felt tears sting her eyes, the ache of loss colliding with the sudden surge of determination. She refused to let another life fade if there was even a small chance to save it. Outside, the sun dipped lower, shadows creeping over the walls as if the entire world was holding its breath. Linda set the kitten on a folded towel on her lap, pressing 2 fingers gently along its ribs, searching for any sign of a heartbeat. Her breath hitched as she thought she felt the faintest flutter, so delicate it might have been her imagination. She quickly began rubbing the kitten's tiny body with the edge of the towel, willing warmth and life back into its fragile form. Daisy kept pacing beside her, letting out soft cries, her fur bristling with anxiety. The house was utterly silent, except for the frantic sound of fabric rubbing over fur and Linda's whispered pleas, as if sheer willpower could coax the kitten back from the brink. Then, just as Linda was about to give up, a tiny gasp rattled through the kitten's chest, startling her so much she nearly dropped it. Its mouth opened, a pink tongue flicking out as it struggled for air, and a thin, squeaking cry filled the room. Linda's heart thudded so hard it felt like it might crack her ribs, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as relief and disbelief mingled in her chest. She glanced at Daisy, who immediately began licking the kitten's fur, her mother's instincts roaring back to life. In that instant, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house and the frantic beating of her own heart, Linda realized this little creature had just changed everything. Linda held the tiny kitten closer, feeling its shivers vibrate through her palms like the ticking of a fragile clock. The fur was damp, the little paws curled inward as though bracing against a world it wasn't ready to face. Outside, wind hissed through the trees, rattling the window panes, but Linda barely noticed. Consumed by the tiny life in her hands, she rocked back on her heels, pressing the kitten gently against her chest, desperate to share her body heat. 1,000 memories of hospital machines and the scent of antiseptic flashed behind her eyes, and she clenched her jaw, unwilling to lose another soul knot today. She whispered softly, almost chanting, as if words alone might weave a thread strong enough to tether the kitten to life. Daisy crouched beside her, tail flicking anxiously, eyes darting between Linda and her mewling litter, still nestled under the bed. The mother cat's fur was ruffled, her breathing shallow, as though sensing the delicate balance between life and loss. Linda could feel the urgency radiating off Daisy like heat, a silent plea that clawed at her own maternal grief. She glanced down at the kitten, noticing a bluish tinge around its nose, its sides barely fluttering with each shallow gasp. The sight punched through her like ice. Panic rose up, threatening to choke her, but she swallowed it down and focused on the rhythmic motion of rubbing the kitten's back. She had no idea if it was enough, but she couldn't stop now. She hesitated, wondering whether to call the vet, but the phone seemed impossibly far away, as if it might as well be on another planet. Part of her felt foolish, kneeling on the floor trying to save something so small and fragile when life itself had proven so merciless. But another part, a fiercer part, refused to let go. In the depths of her chest, something cracked open, pouring out a warmth she hadn't felt since before she became a widow. Her fingers trembled as she gently tilted the kitten's head back, trying to keep its airway open the way she'd seen nurses do. Daisy began nudging Linda's arm again, as though urging her not to give up. The house seemed to close in, the ticking of the wall clock echoing like a countdown. Linda's mind raced with half-remembered advice from animal documentaries. Memories of holding her husband's hand as he struggled to breathe, and the raw terror of helplessness. She found herself mumbling frantic words, half prayer and half command, her tears splashing onto the kitten's fragile spine. The world outside faded away until there was only the kitten, Daisy's worried pacing, and the pounding of her own heart. She imagined what her neighbors might think. A middle-aged woman sobbing over a half-dead kitten on the bedroom floor, but she didn't care. In this moment, nothing mattered except fighting for this tiny spark of life. Then, a tiny, watery cough sputtered from the kitten's throat, followed by another thin cry that echoed off the bedroom walls. Linda froze, blinking through her tears as the kitten flexed its legs slightly, pushing against her fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A surge of fierce determination ignited in Linda's chest. She glanced at Daisy, who let out a sharp, commanding meow as though echoing Linda's resolve. Linda made a decision right then and there. She was not going to lose this kitten. She rose to her feet, kitten cradled in one hand, determination blazing in her eyes. She couldn't walk away anymore, not from this fight, not from this tiny creature that had somehow pulled her back into the world. Linda rushed to the kitchen, gripping the tiny kitten against her chest, her mind whirling as she tried to remember every piece of advice she'd ever heard about reviving newborn animals. The bright overhead lights seemed too harsh, bouncing off the stainless steel sink and making the kitten look even smaller and more fragile. She quickly filled a bowl with warm, not hot water, testing it with her wrist the way she'd once tested baby bottles. Daisy followed at her heels, meowing urgently, her tail puffed up in anxious spikes. Linda gently dipped a soft cloth into the warm water and began wiping the kitten's cold limbs, trying to coax warmth back into its trembling body. Each tiny breath from the kitten felt like a fragile victory, as if the world itself were holding its breath along with Linda. As she worked, Linda noticed the kitten's fur was different from the others, a stark patch of pure white over one side of its face, like a delicate mask. Setting it apart from Daisy's orange and brown offspring, it was as if the kitten bore a sign of otherness, a small creature already marked as unique, as fragile and precious as glass. The realization made Linda's chest tighten with a fierce protectiveness she hadn't felt since she'd been a mother and a wife. Back when she still believed life was predictable, the kitten let out another faint squeal. Its eyes still squeezed shut, but its tiny paws twitching as though grasping for a lifeline. Linda felt an unexpected surge of hope ignite in her chest, mingling with a rush of adrenaline that pushed her exhaustion aside. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive, truly painfully alive. By the time Linda carried the kitten back to the bedroom, the sun had completely set, leaving the house wrapped in velvety shadows. The lamp beside the bed cast a soft golden pool of light over Daisy and the other kittens, who stirred restlessly as Linda returned. She laid the tiny kitten gently beside its siblings, watching as Daisy sniffed it cautiously, then began licking it with urgent strokes. The kitten shivered, then let out another tiny mew, answering its mother's call at last. Linda covered her mouth, unable to contain a sob of relief, as the kitten began inching closer to Daisy's warmth. In that instant, the bitterness that had weighed on Linda's heart for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile but undeniable joy. She realized that saving the kitten wasn't just about preserving its life, it was about reclaiming her own. The next morning dawned crisp and cool, golden light spilling through the blinds and casting stripes across the bed. Linda woke to the sound of soft purring, her eyes drifting open to find Daisy curled protectively around all 5 kittens, including the little white-faced survivor. The one slimp kitten was nestled against its mother's belly, suckling determinedly, its tiny sides rising and falling in strong, steady breaths. Linda felt a ripple of disbelief and gratitude wash over her as she reached out to stroke the kitten's damp fur. Tears gathered in her eyes, but this time they were gentle, cleansing tears, carrying away the dust of grief that had coated her heart for too long. Daisy blinked up at her with slow, grateful eyes, and Linda whispered, "You did it, little one. We did it together." Later that day, Linda called her daughter, her voice trembling as she described what had happened. For the first time in months, they talked not about loneliness or sadness, but about hope, life, and the miracle that had unfolded under Linda's bed. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, neighbors dropping off tiny blankets, bottles, and offers of help. Even the local vet, Dr. Hayes, stopped by, declaring the kitten healthy, though a bit undersized, and marveling at how Linda's quick thinking had saved its life. As Linda stood there with the tiny kitten curled in her palm, she realized she hadn't just saved a kitten, she'd rediscovered a reason to fight, to hope, and to open her heart again. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew she was no longer walking it alone. Linda's home felt transformed in the days that followed, filled with tiny squeaks and rustling sounds as the kittens grew stronger by the hour. The little white-faced kitten, now named Miracle by Linda's daughter, became the star of the litter, its delicate features a daily reminder of the night Linda refused to surrender to despair. Linda found herself lingering by the bed each morning, counting 5 tiny bodies to reassure herself that Miracle was still there, still fighting, still alive. The once oppressive silence of the house was replaced with gentle purring, the rhythm of new life echoing through every room. Linda smiled more often, her steps lighter as she moved about her chores, as if the weight that had pressed on her shoulders for 2 years had finally lifted. She began posting photos and short updates about Miracle on a local community app. Hesitant at first, but surprised at how quickly strangers rallied around the tiny kitten's story. Comments poured in from people who'd lost spouses, battled illness, or felt invisible in their own lives. They thanked Linda for reminding them that hope could be found in the most unexpected places. Neighbors she'd barely spoken to dropped off bags of kitten food and tiny knitted blankets. And one elderly man even offered to build a custom cat tree for Daisy and her babies. Linda welcomed these connections, each new voice stitching her a little more firmly back into the fabric of the world she'd withdrawn from. The simple act of saving a kitten had become the catalyst for her own healing and, perhaps for others, too. Daisy never left Miracle's side for long, keeping watch over her special baby with vigilant golden eyes. Linda marveled at how deeply the bond between mother cat and kitten mirrored her own rediscovered capacity to love and protect. Even as Miracle began toddling around on wobbly legs, exploring the edges of the bedroom carpet, Daisy remained close enough to gently herd her back into the safety of the nest. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Linda would sit cross-legged on the floor, watching mother and kitten curled up together, feeling a calm warmth bloom in her chest. For so long, she'd believed grief would swallow her whole butt in this tiny creature. She saw proof that life insisted on pushing forward, no matter the odds. As Miracle grew, word of her miraculous survival spread beyond the neighborhood. A local TV station contacted Linda, wanting to feature the story of the woman who saved a kitten under her bed, and how that kitten helped heal her broken heart. Nervous but determined, Linda agreed. Standing in her living room with Miracle perched proudly on her shoulder as cameras rolled, she spoke of the night she nearly gave up, of the moment a tiny gasp of air reminded her there was still beauty worth fighting for. The piece aired during the evening news, and soon Linda was flooded with messages from strangers touched by her courage and compassion. For the first time in years, she felt seen not just as a widow, but as a woman with a story that mattered. Months later, Miracle was a sleek young cat with bright, curious eyes and a playful streak that kept Linda laughing every day. People still stopped Linda on the street to ask about her Miracle cat, and she'd smile, scratching Miracle's chin as the cat purred like an engine. Linda began volunteering at the local animal shelter, helping other fragile lives find hope and healing. Her home was full of small, joyful sounds, paws skittering on hardwood floors, soft purring, and her own gentle laughter. Standing at her window one evening, Miracle draped over her shoulder, Linda whispered to herself, "I didn't just save a kitten, I found myself again." And with that, she knew she'd finally stepped back into the light.